Hey everyone, I'm Josh,
And I'm Kelly.
and this is Uprooted Faith. If you are seeing us on your Facebook feed for the first time in a while, you're not dreaming, it is true. We are back on Facebook. We did take about a 6-month hiatus just as a sanity break. We did post content. We'll continue to post content on our YouTube channel, but over this 6 months, we missed talking with you all from our Facebook group. So we're going to go back live, try to do a semi-weekly live stream to cover various topics, and we'll also be posting this to our YouTube channel. So welcome all of you watching us on Facebook, either you're live, you're watching it after the fact, or you're watching it on YouTube. If you are watching YouTube and you want to comment live, you can join our Facebook group. That link is in the description of our YouTube channel, and we'd love to have you on here to share all your comments. So, welcome back.
Yeah.
The scenery's a little different than when we did this previously. We had to spruce up a little bit.
But we still have our phone.
We do. I have our lifeline to God in case we have any questions, right?
Phone a friend.
So, tonight's topic, we'll be unpacking the Old Testament versus the New Testament God, right? So, if you look through the scripture, it does appear, as you just read through it, the God of the Old Testament seems to be a lot more angrier and violenter than the God of the New Testament. Violenter. Than the God of the New Testament, right? Or more violent, however you want to say it. So I guess the question that I'm trying to understand is, this is an uprooted faith, and we're trying to talk about people that may have lost some faith or need to deconstruct it. I guess I'm curious for you all watching, if there was ever a breaking point for you as you're trying to understand, make sense of this Old Testament God and this, we'll say, divine violence that people continue to say, or the Hebrews continue to use in the Old Testament to justify the slaughtering of various communities. Was that a breaking point for you in your religious journey? And that's what I want to unpack tonight and try to understand, why was the God of the Old Testament more violent than the God of the New Testament, right? If you're watching us live, you can put some comments in there if you'd like to participate, or again, if you're watching after the fact, put them in there. We'll get to them in the future. So I guess the first thing, I did do some research, and I found that there were some various scholars that have attempted to count how many deaths were attributed to God in the Old Testament. And depending on who you trust, or I guess what you trust by their calculation methods, it seems like it could be a couple million people died in the Old Testament because of God, or attributed to God. And if they look at like the flood, Sodom, plagues in Egypt, all the hundreds of years of conquests, it seems like if you add it all up and make some assessments for the various populations, it could be to 1 to 3 million people. Whereas in the New Testament, I'm not aware of that many people dying. So I guess the question is, as we look through this, is the perception of seeing the Old Testament God more violent, is that based on any facts, or is it a problem with how we read the scripture, how we teach it, how we interpret it, or the theology behind it? So let's break into that. And what I did is I did some research on a couple of, we'll say, conflicting verses between the Old Testament and New Testament just to get started. So for instance, in 1 Samuel 15:3, God commands the total annihilation of this community, including infants and animals. Compare that to Matthew 5:44, when Jesus says, "Love your enemies and pray for your persecutors." Seems to be some tension there. Genesis 6:7, which is the story of the flood, through this, at the end of this, it claims that God regrets making humanity and floods the earth. And counter that with John 3:16, which says, "God so loved the world that he sent his only son to save it." And finally, in the book of Joshua in 10:40, Joshua destroys everything that breathed as the Lord commanded. Yet you go to Luke chapter 6, verse 27, says, "Do good to those who hate you and bless those who curse you." Now, I know in the past, we've always made fun, or we've joked about cherry-picking Bible verses. But I feel like this is just, I cherry-pick these verses, but they do seem to have some tension and conflict between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. So I wonder if we can start there and help unpack, why is there a difference between the Old and New Testament?
Well, I don't believe that God changes. So there is no God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament. It's just God,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
I don't think God is any different. I think God is eternal, but I think people are different. I think people that were written about in the Old Testament different from the people in the first century of the New Testament, and they're certainly different than we are today because we have the advantage of much more knowledge about biology and all that, and so we are going to interpret things differently based on where we are in history.
Yeah.
You know, in the future, there will be people who will laugh at us and say, I can't believe they didn't understand this, you know?
Sure.
So I think we have to realize that the Old Testament is ancient writings
Okay.
about even more ancient history. So it wasn't written down for a long time, and you know the stories were told, and then eventually they were written down, and then they were edited, and so the final books that we have that make up what we call the Old Testament, you know, it's a lot of people think Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. I don't think that's true. I think that Moses is the figure, you know, he's the main character next to God, of course. And that these stories were told and retold, and then they began to be written down. So, did God tell the people to commit genocide, or did the people think that's what God wanted them to do? And so then they said, God told us to. You know, when you think about that time period, that's what everybody did. If you wanted land, you had to go take it. If somebody was on it, you had to kill them so that you could take their land. That's what everybody did. That's just how you got land in those days. And so, you know, that understanding of, well, God wanted us to have this land. So, of course, God wants us to kill the people because that's how we get the land.
Okay, so I'm going back. So if you back up to maybe the first main instance of this, when the Israelites, you know, fled Egypt and they spent 40 years, you know, walking around before they get the promised land, which was promised to them by God, the land flowing with milk and honey, right? And you saying that, you know, maybe it is true that God did say you go into this land, but God never said anything about go in the land and annihilate everybody that lives in there now, right? That was probably an interpretation of the people at the time, because that's what you do. When you go into a land, you need to conquer it. And by conquering it, you need to...
Right.
And they...
Did God really say, you know, go take that land from those people? We don't know.
Okay.
You know, or is that just how the story got written? And I don't mean to demean the Old Testament. What I think is, you know, we have to look at the whole scope of the Bible as being the story of God.
Okay.
And so we can see characteristics of God in the Old Testament, such as this great love that God has or had for this group of people. You know, beginning with Adam and Eve, and you know, and then with Abraham, and promising Abraham this great nation that would come out of him, and then, you know, hearing the Hebrews cry out in Egypt for help, and making them a special people, making a covenant with them. You know, we see the characteristics of God. But if we aren't careful, we'll look at that and say, well, God has favorites. you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know that God has favorites. I really don't. I don't think so. So you have to go to the New Testament now. And in John 14, Philip asks Jesus, or says, Jesus, just show us God, and then we'll believe. And Jesus says, what do you mean? You know, I've been living with you all this time. If you've seen me, you've seen God. So we have to look at that and go, well, like you know, the scriptures you read from the New Testament. Well, if that's God, then how could God have, you know, done these things in the Old Testament? So I think we have to read the Old Testament knowing that that they are ancient writings. For example, if we read a book like, I don't know, like Tom Sawyer or something, you know, written in that time period, you read it now as 21st century people, we read that, and there's some real obvious racism in a lot of the books of that time, that back then, you know, it didn't even occur to people that was racist, or that was wrong, or it was demeaning. You know, we read that now and we're like, yeah, that's terrible. But that's because we're seeing it with 21st century eyes. But the people that read it back then and wrote it back then, that's just how it was in their minds. You know, I'm not saying that it was right back then. I'm saying that it was accepted. It was, you know, it was commonplace. And, you know, it's just like the whole thing with Dr. Seuss. You know, and now we read some Dr. Seuss books and we're like, oh my goodness, you know, but at that time, nobody went, oh my goodness. So it's kind of like that with the Old Testament. We read that now and we're like, wow, that, you know, God is just bloodthirsty and hateful and vengeful. And, but at that time, that's how they would have processed what happened to them, what their history was. That's how they would have processed it. Well, God wanted us to have this land, so clearly God wanted us to kill all the people because that's how you got land.
So I think it's maybe, I have some follow-up questions, but there may be some a good time to break and look at the Facebook comments, because unfortunately they're not popping up on the screen like I hoped. So I see there's been a lot of comments. People have been waiting 6 months for this, I guess, but I don't know if you could read through those and see if there's anything.
And if Judaism focuses on the Old Testament, but Judaism typically doesn't seem to be a violent religion, true, how would a violent God make sense? Right. And it would be great to have a dialogue with someone who's Jewish, who could have that insight.
Yeah.
Could they have devilish thoughts and thought it was God? I don't know.
I'd say yeah.
Maybe those things in the Old Testament happened, and then the people passed those stories down as if they were ordained by God. Right. That's kind of what I was saying, I think. You know, that's how they interpreted it, and that's how they passed that on.
So with that in mind, how do you discern between the Old Testament scriptures or stories or passages that actually is God interacting as opposed to the people just interpreting that they were told by God? Like, for instance, if we go back to Moses and the burning bush, did God really tell Moses to let his people go, or did Moses justify having everybody leave Egypt because he thought God wanted him to do that, right? And it was mostly on his own accord that he decided to do that. And later on, it's like, well, God told me to, but how do you discern between? I mean, with that mindset,
right.
How do you discern between? Well, you know, God's not violent, so all the violent stuff was just humans interpreting that, but all the love stuff that's in the Old Testament, that's definitely God, right? It seems like there's a conflict there where,
right?
Yeah. How can you make sense of that?
So again, you have to, you have to approach it as just ancient literature, and it's not like today. Same thing with the Gospels. We're like, the Gospels don't agree with each other, so how can they be true? Well, nobody is, taking dictation as things are happening. people tell the stories from their viewpoint, and what's important to them stands out, and nobody tells, everybody who looks at a car accident sees a different picture, has a different story, because we see things from different angles and we have different perspectives. So that's how it would have been, these stories would have been collected and passed down. And it's the overarching story that's important. So it's not, well, in this passage, God said this, and therefore that's what God is like. It's what's the overarching story. We read the Psalms, and there's some really horrible things in the Psalms too.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of tension within the Psalms. Like, God, you're great and generous and loving and slow to anger, and God, why are you doing this to me? And why aren't you helping us? And so it's the perspective of the people who have written about it.
Okay.
And we have to be careful too that we don't look at, this stuff where God said go commit genocide. That didn't, God didn't really say that. But over here, God said this. Yeah, God said that.
Yeah.
We have to be careful. It's, we have to look at the overarching story. We have to look at the character of God as demonstrated through Jesus.
Okay.
And then,
because that is the one difference, is the Old Testament or historical writings, their interpretations of people after, hundreds of years maybe after the stuff happened, whereas the New Testament, Jesus, people are still documenting what Jesus said, but Jesus is a direct line to God, so he has more of a vision to teach people how God is versus the Old Testament.
Yeah, right.
In a way,
So if you've seen Jesus, you've seen God. So how Jesus is how God is.
Yep.
And so then how do you interpret God in the Old Testament? You have to remember it's there. I mean, still the New Testament is ancient as well, right?
Yeah.
But if we read, I don't know, my lack of literature knowledge is showing, but if we read a book that's centuries old, we don't expect that to reflect our current worldview. We read that understanding this was written a long time ago.
Yeah. And
they had these perspectives. They didn't know this that we know, and we need to do that with the Bible as well.
Yeah.
We have to, context is everything.
Now the other thing too that I was thinking of, and this may be a separate discussion altogether, but then how do you grapple with the fact that the Old Testament, they put in worship laws that basically only the holiest of the holiest priests could go into the holy of the holy room to interact with God. So he was not really that approachable. Whereas in the New Testament, he's everywhere. Everybody can interact with him, right? So how do you grapple with the fact that he did seem, you can't be near me unless you're clean, and if you pass a dead body, you got to stay away for 7 days.
Okay, so when they wrote those things down, and I think this also speaks to the character of God. God wanted people to be healthy. He wanted them to respect each other, respect boundaries. And so really all those things were, okay, there's some I really don't understand. There's some commandments I really don't understand. I don't know why they're there, but a lot of them you can see, well, this is the love of God setting boundaries for us that we're always trying to push against. And I don't want to do that, or I don't want to be told I can't do that. But God sets these boundaries, these guardrails for us out of love, because God knows that we're not always real sharp and we can, left on our own devices, will die out as a species.
Yeah.
So God puts those guardrails, especially, in an ancient time when God couldn't go, okay, now look, here's the biology lesson behind this commandment, But so God would say, you can't do this. You have to do this. You have to do it this way. And a lot of that, say, one of the things that's difficult for me is in the Old Testament, it had to be a sacrifice without defect. And that kind of also translated into people. Like you couldn't go serve in the temple if you had a defect. If you had a physical defect, you couldn't do that. And that's always bothered me. But I think it's really the symbolism that don't give God, you're less than. Give God your best. Give the firstborn, as long as the firstborn is perfect. So don't give God the runt of the litter.
Yeah,
that's disrespectful.
Sure.
Because God has given you this. You should give, the portion that you're giving back should be your best.
Yeah.
But I think there's a metaphor there, and there's a teaching about how we treat God and how we treat others. So if we just zero in on individual things, we'll miss the big picture.
Okay. I'm going to change. I guess I have one more question to sort of change a little bit on what we've been talking about, but I wonder if we pause again and see there's a lot more comments too. So
this is great. Keep them coming.
Yeah.
I have to explain that one. So we are moving into a different house, and it is basically across the street from Temple Israel.
Okay.
In West Lafayette. And so Tony says, maybe after we move, we can go across the street to the temple and ask some questions, or invite someone there to Digging Deep. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
make some friends, make some contacts. We'll bring them in.
So one person said, I recently felt that God was not happy with the people of the Old Testament and sent God's son Jesus. And Mary says, the Old Testament people got carried away with status and laws. Jesus came with a new covenant, getting rid of all the extraneous stuff added by people, not God. And that's true. You have your basic law, but then, if you read through the Old Testament, you'll get to this point and you go, didn't I just read this? Because it repeats. And it's re-edited, and so things are added to or explained more fully, and then it's just this tradition with Jewish scholarship to for the rabbis to teach about it and get into the nitty-gritty of it and maybe bring out other aspects of it. There's a thing called midrash, where you retell a story from the Old Testament, but you embellish it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a way of reimagining a story, and that's not looked at as like plagiarism or anything like that. It's not looked at that like that. And so, so over the centuries, then people tried to clarify. It's just like with, keep the Sabbath holy, do no work on the Sabbath. Well, then after a while, somebody says, well, wait a minute, what exactly is work? You can't travel. Well, how far can you travel? Well, can you do this? Can you pull your donkey out of a ditch? Or is that work? You got to wait until the next day. So all these things started getting added as they wanted to clarify things. And so by the time Jesus came around, he was like, you have added so much, and you have become so picky and detailed that you have put this weight on people, and
Yeah.
you do nothing to help them bear it. You just keep putting more and more rules and obligations on people, and to the point where nobody can even know all the rules,
Yeah.
let alone keep them.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's a good point that person brought up in the chat. That it goes back to John 3:16. God so loved the world that He sent His only Son. If you look at God as unchanging, He's been unchanging through all of history. It's the humans that have misinterpreted Him and continue to get to a certain point that God didn't just turn His back and said, okay, I need to do something different. So hence enter Jesus and try to provide some more clarity or sanity back into what the religion had become, right?
yeah,
In a way.
and it's like you read in the prophecy, and it'll say the people turned their back on God, so God punished them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they saw it. Whereas maybe we would look at something and say they turned their back on God and they did what they wanted to do, and then they got the consequences.
Yeah.
It wasn't God punishing them. It was just they got the natural consequences of what they did.
And I wonder if that's ingrained in people, because I know I used to have, and I still do every once in a while, if something bad happens to me, sometimes I think, well, that must be, God punished me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that mindset is because people read through the Old Testament and they get that mindset nowadays even.
Well, also, we've been taught that.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
We've been taught that because it's a way to keep people in line.
Yeah.
If you say you better, you better watch out, or if you do that, God will punish you.
Yeah.
Or if you have bad things happen to you, well, you must have some unconfessed sin.
Sure.
And so God is withholding whatever from you, and that's all wrong.
Yeah.
That's all wrong, but that's more of a social construct that people came up with in order to keep people in line.
Sure.
I mean, we see that in the New Testament too.
Yeah.
Trying to control people by putting all these extra regulations and rules and and just being us and them. We're the righteous Pharisees or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just sinners.
Yeah.
Not all Pharisees were like that. We don't want to lump all Pharisees together. But then also you said something about Revelation and the violence.
So I want to do, this is the next, so the last question I want to unpack, because I found this interesting doing my research, is that the question is the Old Testament more violent than the New Testament? And if you look at this, like what we've been talking about is the Old Testament seems like there's always violence, but the New Testament seems to have violence, but it's mostly centered in the Revelations, which is a future time, or when Jesus is warning people of the end times and saying, if you don't get in line, you'll be locked out, there'll be gnashing of teeth. So from this, what I came up with, it seems like, the God of the Old Testament seems to be angry and violent in the present moment, whereas the God of the New Testament seems to be angry and violent at, in the future, right, at the end times. So I guess my question is, it seems like violence in the Old Testament is more visible violence, war, military, people fighting, whereas the violence in the New Testament is all end times, gnashing of teeth, locked out of heaven. So I guess the question is the Old Testament really more violent than the New Testament? Do you say the violence due to war, is that more violent than the violence of not getting to heaven, right?
Oh, there's so much in there.
It is, and maybe we don't have time for that, but I think it's interesting.
So excited to talk about this, this question and this topic. But where do I begin? So there's a misunderstanding. We've all been taught that that Jesus said, you have to confess your sins. You have to pray the sinner's prayer, or you're not going to get into heaven. And and we've been taught, you have to accept Jesus now, because once you die, it's too late.
Yeah.
I just feel like that is horribly limiting to the God of the universe. That we're going to put that kind of, we're going to put God in that box. The God can't act outside of our idea of present time and eternity. And, what Jesus was saying, a couple of things. So when we read in the Bible, Jesus said, you're going to be thrown to the fires of hell. Jesus said Gehenna. The word hell wasn't even in there. There wasn't a word for that. And we can do a whole thing on hell.
Yeah, we're probably gonna. We can table that for next time. That's a good discussion for next time. We'll write that down.
So Jesus said Gehenna, which Gehenna was a literal place outside of town that was always kept burning because that was the trash heap. That was the garbage dump. It was always kept burning because people put really nasty things in there, and you had to keep it burning so that germs weren't going to spread and so forth. And so a lot of times when Jesus talks about fire, he's talking about purification. So also when Jesus talked about if you don't repent, if you don't turn and go the other direction, then these things are going to happen to you. Sometimes he was talking about like literally you have to stop trying to make things happen with violence and force, because the people eventually the Jewish people finally rebelled against Rome, and it went horribly wrong, and the temple was torn down, just like Jesus said, this temple is going to be torn down. There's not going to be one stone left on another, and he was right. And so a lot of people interpret that as he's talking about the end times. He's talking about going to heaven or going to hell, when Jesus was saying, I'm telling you, don't rebel. That's not how this is going to work. And Jesus clearly gave us that example. He was not violent. He didn't resist. He didn't revolt. He gave his life. He sacrificed. He showed love. And so, but we've been taught through this evangelical Christianity that it's just all about heaven and hell. And, and the gnashing of teeth, when Jesus said, there's going to come a time when there's going to be wailing and gnashing of teeth, when people realize, I got this all wrong, not because they're in hell, but because they are so sorry that they got it wrong. They're so sorry that they wasted their lives, being unforgiving or hateful, and so that wailing and gnashing of teeth is that regret and that remorse.
Okay.
So, and then when you go to Revelation, this is not, the bad stuff is happening to the bad actors. The bad stuff is not happening to people who didn't get saved in time. That's not what any of that's about. That is about the kingdoms and the principalities of this world that are evil and that oppress people and create injustice. And it's about, okay, and really at that specific time, because that's what was happening to Christians. They were being oppressed, they were being killed, nobody would hire them, nobody would do business with them. And the author is saying, hang on, because it's not always going to be like this. It is like this right now. And it does seem like they're winning. But it's not going to be like this, because Jesus has defeated death, has defeated evil. And there will come a time when all that will topple and fall away. And we will be, there will be a new heaven, a new earth, and God will come down here to live with us. So people need to stop being afraid of what Revelation says.
Okay.
It's good news.
Yeah.
It really is good news. You know, bad stuff happens to the bad actors, to Satan, and so forth.
In that story.
So
Well,
it's not about violence. You God's not being violent in the end times either, except against evil.
Sure. Well, I think that's a good topic. We can, for next time, I think we'll unpack the question, what is hell? But I think that we've pretty much unpacked this topic. Yeah. So thanks all for watching. I see there's a lot more comments in here. We'll have to read through them and unpack them. If you're watching us on Facebook or even on YouTube, I guess whatever your social media platform you're watching us, like, subscribe, share, join this group, whatever. Also,
share with a friend.
Yeah, share with a friend. If there are other questions you have or topics about religion as you unpack your faith or do some deconstruction on it, let us know what those topics are. What has been hard pill for you to swallow in the past. We'd love to discuss those topics. So next time we'll be back, we'll target next week, and we'll talk about hell in the background there. And is hell real, or is it just a figurative place? So until next time, we'll see you in the comments. And thank you, Kelly, for providing all this expert knowledge and dropping some knowledge on us.
I don't know if it was expert, but I will talk about it.
Yeah, so also comment, what do you think about what you've heard? And anything you disagree with, we'd love to unpack that as well in the future. So until next time, we'll see you later.
Bye.